Subscribe and click the bell icon for the latest updates and notifications from the Indian Express.
Ruchir Sharma is an investor and writer. He's head of emerging markets and chief global strategist at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. And in your last chapter, there are two broad things that you do say. You say that anti-incumbency, which you started out earlier in the book thinking of it as a flaw or a symptom of the breakdown of the state, the broken state you call it. Towards the end, you think that is a heartening thing. India's anti-incumbency is very heartening because it sort of chips away at hubris. It doesn't allow anybody who's in power to get too comfortable there. The second thing is, throughout the book, one gets a sense that you're looking for that grand reformer. But at the end, again, you bring it down and you say there are no grand reformers and the hope lies actually in smaller changes in states rather than at the center. So given these two broad conclusions, we'll talk about them later also, but what I want to ask you is to place them in the context of this moment, in what could be India's first national security election. Would you still write what you wrote?
This will be the first national security election or not? I'm not even sure because after all, even the 99 election was fought in the backdrop of the Kargil war in terms of it, and you can argue how much that influenced it. I think it's generally believed that whichever party is in power or government is in power tends to benefit when the nation feels it's under siege, or that mentality sort of gets hold. But even assuming that the BJP sort of benefits a lot from this, I still feel that, and assuming that they come back, let's say, even with a similar kind of seats or stuff, and their vote share also goes up a bit, to me it's still a story of many Indias, because the fact of the matter is that no national party in India's history has ever got more than 50% of the vote, going back to the first election, as you well know, and including the Congress, when we were virtually there was one national party for all those decades. And even in this election, at best, what the BJP's vote share from 31%, assuming there's a surge in its favor because of this nationalist kind of movement, it'll go up to maybe 35%, 36%. So for me, the story of many Indias doesn't go away as far as I'm concerned, even assuming that this election we have a repeat of this government and of that. I think that, and to me, I think that even the BJP recognizes that the entire sort of movement, as we've seen in the last few weeks, even today the small headline somewhere is on the BJP's latest alliance with which state. I think today was with the SAD in Punjab. So every day the headline is the same, which is the small headline that they've given up seats in Bihar, given up seats in Maharashtra because to accommodate alliance partners. So for me, that's the journey of, as far as India is concerned. I know that it's something that you're well aware of, that this is still a continent like the European Union. This is not a country, and there's not one narrative. So even though to us at this stage it appears national security is the narrative and that's what's happened the last 2 weeks, I don't know if the story, how much the storyline carries on to into the hinterland, and when we go out there for our 28th trip.
So you start off, in fact, for the bulk of the book, you talk about it as a symptom of the broken state.
Yes.
And because no party can actually deliver, so the only option that the voter has is to toss out the bums.
Yes.
So, but by the end of it, you actually hold it up as the most heartening feature of Indian democracy. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, because I think there was so much talk in India, especially like a year ago, that we were heading towards once again a one-party hegemony. That the BJP had the entire organizational strength, the muscle power, the money power, and so it seemed as if there was nothing which could beat the BJP. That's what the conventional wisdom again was a year ago. And I think that since then what has happened is that both the election results and the fact that so many coalitions have come together state by state is something which has sort of happened despite the odds. And we went to cover some of these elections recently, whether it was Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, even at say Bihar in 2015, even Karnataka. In all those states we were told that the incumbent in power in those places, or the BJP in general, had an advantage on the money front. People told us that they were outspending the opposition by 5 to 1, if not 10 to 1. And the fact that despite those odds, in all these places the opposition managed to win without having any ideology as to who you support, for me that was a very heartening trend, which is the fact that despite all the advantages the incumbent has, that in this country, whoever is in power, the entire business community fawns over that party. The entire sort of, money power seems to be with that party because they're able to raise all this money given the strength that they have. Despite these very obvious advantages, the fact that the underdog with, much less money or, and even arguably a weaker organizational is able to win. To me, there's something very heartening about that, it's not all about that, because there's such cynicism amongst my friends, the so-called upper middle class, etc. The entire conversation is about money. Oh, this party, they're spending so much, they have so much money, etc. It's almost as if, and the conversation in the capitals are like often in Delhi, Bombay, is as if the business people are always being able to buy out whichever politician is in power, they're able to manipulate stuff. Despite that, the fact that the voter at the end of the day is able to toss out the incumbent, to me is such a sort of heartening sting.
The other conclusion, which is less heartening and where you sound very disappointed, is your search for the reformer, the grand reformer. You talk of your hope, I think in this context, with Naidu, with Vajpayee, with
even Sonia Gandhi. Yeah.
And in fact, there's this lovely anecdote about Naidu, where you say that you were traveling with him in his high-tech van,
yes.
And inside the van he's a reformer, and when he goes up to the roof to talk to the crowd, he's a populist.
Yeah.
So it's like he changes color immediately. So, but by the end of the book, again, you sort of give up on that.
I grew up like in the 80s and 90s with this sort of naive feeling, you can argue, as a kid, that we got our political freedom so early. Why don't we get more economic freedom? That is the very basic question which would haunt me. And so when I first started writing, my entire sort of thing was that, maybe India should have more economic freedom. And I grew up in the sort of era where we all celebrated Thatcher and Reagan and stuff like that. Like in that sort of stuff. And I remember having my first meeting, extensive meeting. I'd met her before with Sonia Gandhi in 2002, which I document in the book, with both Sonia and Rahul Gandhi, meeting them in 2002. Again, I was, 28 back then. And, I still had this hope as a young thing that maybe I can go speak to Sonia Gandhi and tell her that, this is what the world is doing, this is what the reforms are taking place at that point in time. And I thought she was relatively new to Indian politics, and maybe she would sort of understand a new language, etc. And after an hour-long meeting, I walk out crestfallen that basically I felt I was on a completely different wavelength. And then 2004, Naidu lost, despite the sort of, the fact that he was hailed as the Davos man, as the person who would go there and do all these sort of stuff. I remember, I quote here what he told us in 99, after he won the election in 99, that this is a message to the world, that people are skeptical, the fact that reforms don't take place anywhere, but in India, free market economic reform can actually work. He's on record telling you that. So there was a moment of hope, but then from then onwards, basically, the realization just kept on sinking in, that in India, maybe this is just not going to work. And I think that the last thing was to do with Modi's election in 2014. So I have these encounters that when Modi got elected in 2014, for a while, so I wrote, and I know that some people weren't happy. I remember writing for the Wall Street Journal a piece that I possibly look back with maybe some embarrassment. But I wrote this piece for them, they asked me to write the piece just after he got re-elected, saying that maybe this is India's Reagan moment. They loved it in the West. They all picked it up. My idea was that because he was talking minimum government, maximum governance, that maybe he's going to go down the path of reducing it. Because, we were all fed up, if you remember back then, about the fact that there was one welfare scheme after another that the UPA would announce with no focus on economic reforms. And so my hope was that maybe Modi, some residual thought that maybe Modi now finally would sort of, actually do this. And then I looked at and then for me, then I started, the biggest reform was demonetization, which for me is the most, was a sort of policy that only a communist nation basically, like a Chavez or maybe like someone like a Castro did. So I was very upset with what happened with that. And now I see at the end of the Modi term, it is back to one scheme after another to help.
So what, according to you, went wrong? Because you also write about visiting Gujarat when Modi was chief minister and being very impressed by the kind of economic reform that he had undertaken there, the forces he had set in motion. So if this is a person who did this as chief minister, why do you think he could not do that as prime minister?
I think I misunderstood that thing, because I think that the issue is that even in Gujarat, when I look back and is that it was, you see, it's very different to run a state and a country. At a state, you can still try and talk to people and try and sort of, fix things up. It's very much a project management kind of approach, and you can try and put the right people in the right, state-owned enterprises and try and get that done. At a national level, I feel it's very difficult to do that. At a national level, you have to sort of devolve power and give as much power as possible to the states and other people to do it. So I think the difference is that what works at a state typically does not work at a national level.
Why do you not like Rahul Gandhi? Because from the time that you meet him first in the book to the time that the book ends, you talk of how I think he got off to a bad start with you in the first meeting, where I think out of a 2-hour meeting he spoke for 1 hour 59 minutes, and you felt that he was the guy who speechifies. So, but you do say that there is an evolution later. But what is?
Yeah, so to say that I don't like is a strong thing, basically. But I'd say that my idea is to document what happened with us, right? So in 2007, I talk about this meeting in Moradabad where we meet with him. And here is a contingent of 20 people. And some of these people, as you know, are pretty well informed about India, pretty well informed about politics. And instead we get a speech of 1 hour 59 minutes about the caste politics of UP and what it is like. So obviously it's something which I found very disorienting. In 2010, we meet him in Bihar. And he does, after keeping the crowd waiting for 4 hours for the Bihar 2010 campaign, he doesn't even sort of acknowledge us properly, as a group, etc. And I felt it was after the 2009 victory, he almost sort of thought that that victory was all about him, and because of the UP election and stuff, possibly, and became even more distant and aloof compared to what we saw him even back then. And then we found that in 2000, then we had subsequent interaction with him in 2012. He was still sort of talking to us rather than engaging with us. I have this anecdote in 2012, which I find one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, where we have this Financial Times, like a very senior journalist with us, and at some level she asks the question of him, and he basically sort of, basically snaps back at her that how long have you been in India? How long do you understand India? With that sort of approach, and she replies in Hindi, I've been here long enough, and I've known, I've met your grandmother at Allahabad, So I mean, basically sort of knows it really, knows India really well and stuff like that. So that was the pattern. I did begin to see some easing up of that just before the 2014 election, and he himself has said on record that the 2014 election was the biggest learning for him. So there's possibly been a change in him in the last few years. I've not had any extensive interaction with him, since then. But the whole idea is to trace his journey, whether it's got to do with Rahul or it's got to do with Modi in terms of what they were and how and what they have become subsequently.
Priyanka Gandhi, on the other hand, seems to have made a wonderful first impression with you, because I remember you describe her leaning out of the car, and you describe her as an exuberant teenager in a sea of friends.
Yeah, when we saw her in Amethi and Raebareli, the view then was that maybe she is the one. Because at that point in time, there was still speculation that she'll come into politics, and it's not just Rahul who will be there. So I think that is the point, that I thought that she's going to, that she made a real impression on the group in terms of her campaigning skills. Now today it's a very different India. What difference she can make today, I don't know in terms of the fact. But back then it felt, very different in terms of the fact that, and I guess we were contrasting her with Rahul all the time. So at that point in time, she felt as if she could speak Hindi much better, she could connect with the people much better. But as I said, that now we have to see, in terms of how Rahul does. He's changed his campaigning style. He's adopted the same sort of, Modi kind of shout and call, as we call it, which is to basically say something and wait for the crowd to respond. He's adopted many of those techniques, so he's changing himself.
Also the statist tendencies of the government.
Yes.
You can just cross into that. I mean, from the Reagan movement to statist tendencies of the government. I mean, if there are some examples that you can put across for us, I mean, which made you draw towards this line now?
The central government today actually does not know how many schemes there are underway. I'm told that at the last count they counted, there were more than 1,000 schemes, central and central government assisted schemes. And even when it comes to schemes which the BJP and Modi criticize when in opposition, like Manrega, you can argue about its merits and demerits, but he did criticize it a lot when he was in opposition. Today, for example, the allocation for that are up substantially, right? I mean, in terms of what happened. So it's like we've gone from one scheme after another to another. And the basic stuff of privatization. Now that's something which even in the Vajpayee government we saw some privatization. Today I think privatization, like in this country, is a dead issue. And to me the biggest sign of the status control in India is the fact that no business person will ever speak out against the government or even tell you about their true political leanings. And this is very different from the US. Like US today, if people don't like Trump, business people don't like Trump, they make it very apparent. Every CEO, they will tell you whether he or she is a Democrat or a Republican. And they will openly fund, like such, I mean, I'm invited to such fund gatherings all the time that, we're doing this for this senator, that, openly, etc. In India, the fear of the politicians is incredible. As I say also that when I asked one of the, the typical thing, the industrialists, off the record something else, on the record something else, you ask them off the record, why don't you go and say to the politician, at least even in private, that, this is how you really feel, that this is what needs to be done. The response will often be marna hai kya, basically, that's the response which is there. So to me, these are all signs of a very statist stuff, that if you say anything against it, the amount of opposition to that, I mean, the fear that they can come down on you like a ton of bricks is as dominant today as I think it's ever been. I think then the sensitivity was much more regarding the whole Gujarat riots and all that kind of stuff on the communal front. But I'd say that the business people then would really tell me back then, and that's what I document in the book, that when they would go speak to him to get stuff done, it would happen right away. At least that much they felt was the focus on development when he was there.
Vajpayee headed a coalition government and did big bang reforms, including wholesale privatization, IPCL.
I won't say wholesale, it was some privatization which was done.
It was quite, I mean, you look at BSNL, I mean, you can say,
yeah.
So he did it under a coalition government, whereas what you're saying is Modi hasn't done much of reform, despite heading a single party majority government. What is it? I mean, is there some underlying political economy, or do you think the BJP itself has changed to be a more status party?
As I document in the book, two things basically. One, that there is no relationship in this country between coalition governments and reforms, or coalition governments and growth versus stable governments. I mean, Indira Gandhi arguably ran the most strong and stable government and was the most statist in India's history. Two, that I think that the context matters a lot, which is in 2001, 2002, when we got Big Bang reform. Whether it's Big Bang, we can argue, but at least we got some reform. India was going through a massive slowdown. The growth rate had really slipped a lot. And in India, I find the best reforms only take place when the governments have their back to the wall. The 91, 92 instance, you can argue even back then, people forget the narrative back then, how frustrated the government was with very slow economic growth. Economic growth those days was about 5% or so. And people were really frustrated that why can't we grow at more than 5% in terms of that? So you got reforms. I think that and I said this, I think one of the biggest mistakes on this government made, and I think that it happened more out of incompetence of the stats department than of any malintent. And I wrote it at that point in time, was to accept the GDP data revisions in February of 2015. Because it was early in their term, and I think that, the GDP data revisions to me looked totally ridiculous, that it just did not pass any smell test. And by accepting those GDP data revisions, what happened was that they basically began to think the economy is doing a lot better than it was. And I think that since then, basically, this entire narrative has been about how things are fine, without quite accepting what the reality is. So to me, that, if you ask me, it sounds technical, but to me, that was one of the biggest mistakes, was to accept that revision which took place. And that's a price I think we're paying for even today.
So in your book, The Rise and Fall of Nations, you talk about billionaires being both
good and bad.
And also seeing that in context of what James Crabtree has written in his book, Billionaire Raj, the three fallouts of globalization and liberalization, one being debt, crony capitalism and corruption. And these were the sort of ideas against which Narendra Modi had campaigned in 2014 to end corruption. That was the narrative that's being built. Do you think they have succeeded in that, or could that also be an election issue in 2019?
I think in India, corruption is always an election issue. So that I think is still there. I mean, I think that what has happened in India, as I've documented, is that we have seen some rise of better billionaires in India. Like the good to bad billionaire ratio, I in fact said so even in The Rise and Fall of Nations, has changed a bit in favor of good billionaires. But I think a lot of this has happened because the commodity boom went bust. The real estate sector went bust. Those are the sectors where you get a lot of sort of bad billionaires who come from, compared to sectors such as technology, which has done really well this decade. So I think that has happened independently almost of the government because of the cycles that we are in. But in general, whether, that I think that at the top level, there is, amongst the people, there is still a perception that there is no, that corruption may have come down at the top. But on a daily interface level, I think that most people will tell you that they don't feel the difference. So I still feel that that is a reason which will continue to sort of, stoke some resentment and anti-incumbency, because at a daily level, people are still complaining about that.
So in your private conversations in the recent past, what are the industrialists thinking about the current government?
There is generally amongst industrialists and staff, there is a general frustration that they wanted more. And I think that there is a fear factor which they don't like. At the end of the day, I think every Indian at the heart of it is a true democrat. So even if they are forced to say something in public, in private, that somewhere it grates, somewhere it sort of, has a sort of effect on them. So I think that is definitely a dissonance that they have to live with. But they are obviously, like in private, they'll be much more critical. But I think that's true of any government, to be honest with you, that they tend to be more critical in private. But the same thing here, that they expected to be given much more of a free hand and not to have this sort of, fear kind of factor.
Do you think the Congress under Rahul Gandhi is moving more and more towards left of the center, as if it's against the corporate sector?
What people say out of power is something which I always discount compared to what they say when they're in power, both ways, right? That's what I try and say. So I think that I think that in India, the big risk I see today is the fact that maybe we're getting more competitive populism, which is one scheme after another for farmer, this and the other because of that. This left of center, right of center, I don't know. I think in India what happens is everyone tends to be an incremental reformer when they come to power. So one of the big things in my book that I make the point is that in India, the reforms, if you expect, look at it state by state. That's the real Indian story which is coming through. That at state by state, you end up getting more development, more reforms. Like in the US, I see today, the number of state chief ministers who land up trying to sell their state as an investment destination, that's a big change we have seen, which was not there like 20, 30 years ago.
Also the distance between the city and the village, because you mentioned this in your book that the way to cover an election and or to understand it is to go out, launch yourself into the rural countryside, that you cannot do it from the metropolis. But that distance, over these years, these 25 years, have you watched it shrink because of technology, because of migration? Is this village not as distant from the city now?
Yeah, undoubtedly, like you have, the spread of technology and stuff. But one thing which I still document in the book is the fact that I start the journey from my mother's hometown of Bijnor and I end it there. And I still find that as far as voting is concerned, and all of you are great experts and I'm at this, I still find that caste tends to dominate. It's the starting proposition. No party will tell you that the candidate selection is not based first on caste and community. So to me, yes, things have shrunk at some level, but this is one of the things I always get into some trouble with, because in the urban areas among my friend circle, talking about caste is considered politically incorrect, right? How can you talk about it, etc. Even if I make a joke to somebody that oh, you're a Brahmin, you can eat first or something like that, oh, people just get totally shocked. I'm making a joke, but they get shocked. But the moment you go outside, you realize that is the reality. So I feel that reality hasn't changed in all the years of covering these election campaigns. That is still the starting point in most places.
There's another interesting statistic you've got, a small you said that in 1988 there was no chief minister who was single. And by I think 2016 there were 7 of them.
By last year
there were 7 of them.
Yeah.
So do you see this as a trend?
Yeah, that's one of the most fascinating subplots I find in the book, which is the fact that everybody was a family-based leader, and that was very much sort of in sync with Indian culture, right? That how important is marriage, the pressure to get married, the pressure to this, and everybody, all the chief ministers, everybody used to be. By last year we counted that of the 20 states in India, major states, 8 chief ministers were single or unattached there. And the pioneer in this trend, I have to say, was possibly Jayalalitha, that she was possibly the first true big single leader where there were all sorts of, her background and all sorts of stuff is made out of it, and she was marched on. Then you had Mayawati. And then so I'd say that this is a trend, but I think there are different reasons why this trend has come into play.
So is this the Indian voter making a statement against dynasty?
In some way, I think that it is. I still feel that dynasty dominates in this country. That is still something which is there. But I think that there are 3 reasons why I think, if I can say why this has happened. One, yes, there are leaders like Modi, Adityanath, the RSS background people. These people are trying to make a distinction that we are basically single, so we can't be corrupt. That is the distinction that they are trying to make. There's nobody we have to benefit. I think that the Jayalalitha Mayawatis didn't make a statement out of that, but for them it was more happenstance, that the circumstances that they lived through, which had to do with, I think, a very patriarchal society where they felt that they were being sort of, they were fighting against an entire cabal of people. I think that is the reason why they ended up becoming, so it was more happenstance as far as they were concerned. And the third thing I also feel is something as basic as this, that in India, politics is a very 24/7 business, and the distinction between personal and private is not there. So when my American editors read this book, the one thing which struck them the most is that it is unbelievable what sort of intimacy of the interactions you have with the leaders. That it is unthinkable, they said in America, for you to have a meeting with a leader in their bedroom.
But the one strand you seem to suggest which will play the major role in 2019 is alliance.
Yeah.
The alliance making. So Modi also actually seems to have cottoned onto that.
Exactly.
His theme song is Mahagathbandhan versus Mahamilawat.
Yeah.
So why do you say that it's all going to devolve on alliances?
No, it's because I said that even in like something that you're all well aware of, that even in 2014 when Modi won the election at the peak of his wave, he got 31% of the national vote. But the ratio between the number of seats he won and the number of votes he got was the highest in India's history. Yeah. The 9-to-1 ratio. That ratio was because the entire opposition was so badly fragmented. So the fact that if the opposition had been a bit more united, then even at the peak of the Modi wave, he would have not got the majority. So that's why I think that even this time, I think they've understood the game. Even the BJP, therefore, is sacrificing seats in many critical states to be able to sort of get the coalition politics correct.
How the BJP government has performed over the last 4 years, and does it call, I mean, is there an enthusiasm that because you visited last year also because of state elections and all?
Yeah.
What is your reading on that front? Are people, what are people's thought on that?
Yeah.
Can I ask a related question?
Sure.
I think this government is going down with decelerating growth.
Yes.
I mean, last 2 years below 7% growth.
Yeah, whatever the number is, we don't know, but the trend is that.
But the trend is very clear.
Yeah.
First 3 years, higher growth, then you are going down. Whereas I think Vajpayee was the other way around, right? I mean, he went on and accelerating but went out. So again, how will this...
Okay, so as I mentioned to you earlier, that I think that development is at best one of the 6 factors that may matter. And there's one statistic also which I quote in the book, which I find is one of my most telling statistics, that there have been 27 instances in India's recorded economic history when a state government has recorded a growth rate of 8% or more over its 5-year term, the average thing. In 50% of those instances, the state government lost the election. 8% economic growth a year for 5 years, and 50% of the instances, the state government loses the election. That just tells you the fact that development is at best one of the 6 factors that matter in an election. In America, it's so much very different. They call it the pocketbook theory of elections there, that you model what is your unemployment rate and inflation rate, and you'll get a result. I think that development is at best a marginal issue in elections, and to win an election in India based on development is extremely difficult.
What is your observation, the lowest common denominator across geographies? At the bottom of the pyramid, what changes you have observed in 27 trips?
Yeah, so you notice very small changes, like, so the state I document as the most transformed state has been Bihar, as far as Bihar is concerned. By far the most transformed state in the times that we went through. So Bihar, like, you can begin to notice very small changes. Like, first time we went for a Bihar election trip was February of 2005, I remember. Completely apart from lawlessness, etc., we know how to notice small changes in how people dress. Like, you go to election rallies, hardly anybody had any footwear. There's basically no footwear out there that you would go. By the time you went for election rallies in Bihar in 2010, people were wearing slippers. By the time you went for the election rallies in Bihar in 2014, people were wearing slippers, wearing shoes with open soles. And then now they begin to wear shoes with closed soles, but generally open soles. So that's the little transformation you begin to see. Then the clothing, that even now when you go to Bihar, what you notice is that people still don't wear wool. Because it's maybe still too expensive for many people. So now they're wearing multiple layers of clothing, acrylic clothing, etc. of clothing. The other change I've noticed a lot is the fact that you just see many more women out there voting now. You go, you see the lines, etc. There are many more women now voting out there than used to be the case, like maybe 20, 30 years ago. So I think those are the kind of subtle changes that you try and pick up when you're out on the road.